And we are live. Greetings, salutations, and welcome to space. Today we are talking generation ships, and I could not be more excited. This is a topic that we literally have the man who wrote the book, Michael Mammay. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I
Oh, it
did.
is.
I wrote the
Yeah,
book.
literally,
I didn't mean to,
literally wrote
but
the
yeah.
book. In fact, wait. Let me move you around. Michael is going to show off
Oh
the
yeah.
book, which is literally called
Okay.
Generation
My
Ship.
camera. I'm bad
Uh,
at this.
So
There you
Michael
go.
Mammay is a retired officer and a retired army officer, very important, and
Mhm.
a graduate of the United States Military Academy. He has a master's degree in military history, and he is a veteran of more wars than he cares to remember. His first novel, Planetside, was a Library Journal Best Books of 2018 pick. Congratulations. And the
Thank you.
sequels Spaceside and Colonyside received starred reviews. Generation Ship, was his first foray out of the military sci-fi subgenre that came out in October 2023, and he lives with his family in Georgia. So yes, Michael Mammay literally wrote the book on generation ships. So that is what we will be talking today. You do
Yeah,
have a book coming out in 12 days, don't you, Michael?
I do. Yeah, the fourth book in the Planetside series is coming out. It's called Dark Side. It comes out in about 12 days. Tuesday, whatever. I don't know how many days that is. A week from Tuesday. It comes out on the September 24th. All books come out on Tuesday, right? And so that'll be, unless you're in Europe, which probably comes out on Thursday, which I don't know why that happens.
We don't make the
Um,
rules. We don't understand the rules.
yeah,
We
we,
just
we
write the
don't.
books.
We do. And yeah, so that one comes out. And Generation Ship was my last book. I would be careful about saying I wrote the book on it, because certainly better and more notable authors than me wrote Generation Ship books before I ever got there. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of them as we go on.
Certainly. We will be unpacking generation ships during this. But folks, I'm also here for your questions. Throw those questions in the chat, and the ever inimitable Secondhand Samurai will be grabbing those, and we will be answering those before the hour is up. So stay tuned for all that. But I think with a concept that's kind of very but potentially new to people, a
Yeah.
good place to start is what is a generation ship? How do you define a generation ship?
Yeah. Well, some a famous author once said space is big, right? Like really big. Um, and so in science fiction, if you want to get, and we're going to talk about, when I talk about science fiction today, look, there's science fiction that's set on Earth, but we're going to talk about galactic size science fiction when you're going off of your home planet, um, because it's big. As science fiction authors, we've got to come up with a way to make it smaller, where we can journey, where we can get somewhere else. If you want to do a story on another planet, you've got to get there, right? And one of the most common ways we do that right now is with faster than light travel, right? You do the Star Wars, right? Star Wars, we go to warp speed and we jump, right? You go to warp 7 if you're a Star Trek person, right? You do something, you go through a gate in a lot of stories, something that allows you to travel that may be theoretically possible, but faster than light speed, right? Travel is one of them. If you want to bring that back into the more possible, right, the more grounded, hard science fiction kind of things, it's going to take a long time. You can't travel faster than the speed of light, right? You can approach the speed of light, but you can't travel faster than it. So the nearest planets are a long, long way away, and you have to have some way to get there. And the generation ship is a trope, which it's the title of my book, but a generation ship in itself is a trope that allows for that travel. You're born on the ship, you die on the ship, and your ship is traveling for hundreds of years, potentially thousands of years, and your society exists on that ship in order to get to another planet, right? And so it almost becomes about the journey. In this case, if you're setting your story on a generation ship, it becomes about the journey almost as much as the destination, right? Because you're now creating your own world that is completely encased, inside of polycarbonate fiber. Okay, it's inside of a spaceship, so it's a closed ship. There's all kinds of things you could do with a generation ship, right? You could do a closed ship mystery, which is, you could do a cozy mystery set on a generation ship if you wanted, because there's no way to get off, right? Everyone is by definition in the same room. So you could do an Agatha Christie kind of thing on a generation ship, but you could do it for all kinds of things. But that's what a generation ship is, right? You're born there, you die there, you live there, you work there. Everything about your life is encompassed by this ship.
Sure. And I guess really the crux of the generation ship is what you said. It's about the journey. Somebody has decided that we need to colonize a place that's very far away, or get people very far away, or sometimes the trope is escape the earth and go somewhere.
Yeah.
And generations upon generations of people are needed to run the ship and to have lots of babies to keep the ship running. It's in the title, generation after generation, right? So that the ship
Yeah.
can, over these centuries, I guess in some cases,
In
get where
case,
it needs
yeah.
to
I mean,
go.
in mine, it's 2.5 centuries, right? It
Wow.
kind of depends on how far you got to go and how fast you want to get there. For story purposes, I capped the speed of my ship at 11% of light speed. And so when you start to do that, right, if you want to go 20 light years to some of the nearest stars that are like ours, nearest yellow suns that are things that are likely to support human life. If you want to do that, you're looking at 20 light years, right? And if you're going at 10%, you're about 200 years just to get to the nearest ones.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about a journey. It's a journey. It's like the longest road trip in the world, where you have to teach your children's children's children all the road trip songs.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Well, and
how I imagine
you
it in
have
a
to
way.
account for everything. You have to account for everything that is society. So from a world building perspective, there's so much that you can do with it because you could focus on everything. I mean, you have to feed people forever, right? While you're growing your food in space, you have to manage your population because you're at a limited resource. So on my ship, at 75, you're put to death, mandatory death at 75 years old,
Wow.
because you are now deemed too old to work
Yeah.
productively for the crew, and we need your bed. We need your
Yeah.
spot, right? We're capped out at 18,000 people.
Sure. If
And
you're taking resources and
that
not giving back,
creates,
then
that
yes.
creates some kind of conflict right there. Is that okay? Now you're 74, right? And I created a thing on the ship where for your 74th to 75th year, you work until you're 70, and then you go into general support for 4 years, where you work in a different arena. You work a desk job or whatever to support the ship, administration kind of things, and then for the last year, it's your jubilee, right? It's your party year where we celebrate you, and we celebrate your sacrifice for the cause, for the ship, and then you have your death day, which is like your ultimate birthday, right? Like the day before you die, you get your final meal. Everybody comes and celebrates you, and you go until you go under the needle, and you're painlessly put to death and fed to the recycler.
Really interesting. We've moved on to common tropes and expectations. I'm not
Yeah.
mad at it. I think this is
Okay.
awesome. This is where
Yeah.
I wanted to go. What about things like bloodlines? Because when you have lots and lots of people having babies for generations upon generations in a closed box, I feel
Yeah.
like that's one of the tropes that often comes up for generation ships. Is that something that you dealt with or you've read about?
Well, I mean, for me, it was the first thing I thought about, and I consulted a geneticist. So I have a good writing partner friend, Dan Cobalt, who is an author, and he's a geneticist, and so we started to talk about just the ideas before I was even writing the story of, okay, what would we look like? So 18,000 is not a random number, right? That's a big enough population where you can do things, but also we don't. Natural childbirth is almost non-existent on the ship, because pregnant women in space is bad, right? So, pregnant women in space. So we allow for that on the ship. A certain number of people can get a license to have a natural baby in a given year, but most of them are born in artificial wombs. So they're done through artificial insemination, which can, one, expand your gene base, because we're going to pick specific sets of DNA from the husband and the wife, or the mother and the father, because it's not always husband and wife, right? We have same-sex couples on the ship, but they can still have babies because we have the science, right? Because by the time you have a science to go 10% of the 11% of the speed of light and travel, you can imagine whatever genetic advances that you want, right? Where we're going to, I mean, why do a brother and sister not have a baby, right? Because genetically that's really bad. There is a very high percentage chance that it's very bad, but it's not 100%. They have a higher percentage chance of it being bad, right? So if you pull something, if you could pick the exact genes from each of them that were going together, you could theoretically do it that way, according to my geneticist friend. So we do. So there's a lot of that, and that is one of the tropes. That is one of the plot lines on the story. Is a couple that half of the couple wants to have a baby, and the other half does not. Because we're also in a small town, right? 18,000 people. We're in a small town, so it's a soap opera. Right. There's drama.
Yeah.
Everyone's in everybody's business. Like everybody knows everybody else. Right. And stuff like that.
Yeah. I feel like I love that. And again, like that kind of closed box gives so much space for interpersonal drama, because when you say to somebody, I just need space, there is on the one hand, there's literally no space. And on the other hand, all there is space. Right. So you can imagine the pressure turning on social situations very quickly. And I think one of the things that has been a common trope has been things like mutinies, things like social revolt against authorities. Is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, so you're a closed society that has to have draconian rules, right? And so in my ship, we did some things, right? There's a charter for the ship. Okay. We are now 250 years into the journey, and we have this charter, right? And it has all the rules. Well, if you're 10, 12 generations in, you weren't there when they wrote that, right? Somebody, your great, 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 great grandfather wrote that. Okay. And you don't care. You've lived your whole life for this thing. So in my ship, the thing that causes the conflict is they're approaching their destination.
Interesting.
Right? So now everything's changed as far as the people belong, but the charter doesn't change. Right. So we have this set of rules that was written 250 years ago, and we're forced to live by it in a society where it doesn't necessarily apply apples to apples. I don't know, sort of like the Constitution, right, which was written 250 years ago, and we're still gonna follow the Second Amendment. And I don't want to get into a political discussion, but it's a political book, right? I picked 250 years for my ship for a reason, right? The Constitution, 250 years old, give or take, may or may not apply to every single situation that we face today, and so some people are mad about that, right? Whichever side of that you're on, staunchly defending, staunchly against, we have a possibility for conflict, and people come into conflict. As we're approaching the planet, do we really have to die at 75? Yeah. Well, one 75-year-old lady asked that question, and it kind of kicks off the conflict.
Yeah. I think that's amazing. I was literally writing a blog article for World Anvil about the grand metaphors of science fiction and fantasy, and I'm so happy to hear that you have found that fascinating parallel between generation ships and some of the political things which may be going on today in this world.
Yeah.
I think another common trope that I've seen, and again, I am not the leading expert on generation ships. I did not write the book Generation Ship.
Okay.
Is the grand secret? Is that one you've seen? Like there's a grand secret, a small enclave of people know, but nobody else knows. The inhabitants go about their lives, and there's this sort of dramatic irony that creates tension once the audience knows the grand secret that the hierarchy knows, but then nobody else knows. It's something I feel like I've seen play out multiple times in generation ships.
Yeah, I do think that's there. I think I definitely thought about that and considered using that. For instance, if somebody was talking back, with a very powerful laser kind of communication, talking back to Earth and getting information from there. And I considered that, but I had so many other plot lines that it kind of became overcome by events.
Oh, yeah.
And we decided to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I feel like we've touched on some good tropes now.
Sure.
We've kind of unpacked a little bit what a generation ship is. Let's talk examples. And chat, I'm recruiting you to help as well. Good examples of generation ships from movies, from novels, from RPG games, whatever you've got, I want to hear them. Michael, can you kick us off?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. I mean, the big ones, right? Probably Rendezvous with Rama, which is Arthur C. Clarke. So if you're going to talk about science fiction and you're going to go back to you're not going to go wrong by starting with Arthur C. Clarke, right? So that's probably a good place to start. You know, in the modern generation, Record of a Spaceborne Few, Becky Chambers. A lot of people have read that. Kim Stanley Robinson, Aurora, is definitely a good one. Children of Time, Adrian Tchaikovsky. A lot of people have read that book, but it is kind of a generation ship book, but it really doesn't focus on the generation ship as much as, because I mean, if you're reading that book, you're reading it for the spiders, I think. I certainly was. If you want to see world building done with spiders, it's really, really cool. Intelligent Spider, it's a great book. Poseidon's Children, Alistair Reynolds. That's kind of a trilogy, I would say. I think it's a trilogy. Generation ship. A good one from recent times that you probably haven't heard of is Breaking Day, Braking. Adam Oyabanji wrote that maybe 3-4 years ago, and that's that's another really good generation ship book. There's a generation ship as a kind of a side plot in The Expanse. The Mormons are building this generation ship where they want to travel. And if anyone's going to build, if you're a Mormon, don't take offense to this. If anyone's going to build a generation ship, it's going to be the Mormons. I think that was just such a great piece of tying the real world and world building into, who would want to do that? Well, they might. And so you had that ship. Now it didn't become a generation ship. They used it as a missile instead. Spoiler, if you haven't seen The Expanse.
Spoiler alert.
But it's like 10 years. Those books are like 10 years old, right? So
yeah,
that's your fault if you haven't read it. Okay, those are really the ones that come off the top of my head. There's probably more, but honestly, I think those are probably the big ones.
The places I've really seen it are for sure Star Trek. It's cropped up multiple times, and never as a main plot line, but in an episode several times there's been a generation ship, and we've seen things about that. I'm a massive Trekkie, so
Battlestar Galactica is in theory a generation fleet,
was
but you don't really
what I was thinking by accident.
That's
what I think is so interesting
really,
about that.
But it's also kind of a day in the life of. It's not. I mean, but you do see the ships. They do. There are the plots where the growing ships, the ships that grow the plants are having troubles, or they do have supply issues. So you do see a little bit of that, but it's really obviously that's more of a. Well, it depends on which version you're talking about. I'm old enough to have seen the old version, but the 1970s version. But yeah, that's a generation fleet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm familiar with the new version of Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, I think most people would be more likely 2004.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. A really interesting, I would say, twist on the trope, subversion of the trope. Like it's a generation fleet, but it's a generation fleet by accident, and a lot of what's involved is adjusting to. Often when you see a generation ship, it's been on the road for some time when ... something has happened, or there's been a mutiny, or a bunch of people who were asleep in stasis have woken up because it was a generation ship that was also taking people instead, or something's happened. They've come under attack. They've gone off.
A Passenger, I think Passenger, that movie, which has a lot of problems with it from other issues, but was people sleeping, but generally the sleeping people who have woken up can be a way how you become a generation ship without meaning to. Which would be neat, because you could almost do like a ship that wasn't prepared to be a generation ship and now is. But they're carrying frozen people or embryos or something. But you could also do a half and half, right, where you have a live crew. And I want to say it was a book, Mur Lafferty, Clones. The clone book, I can't remember the name of the title of it right now, but it was a generation ship that had a small population alive, and they were carrying embryos that they would wake up on the other end.
Very cool. If you want to hear more from Mur Lafferty, by the way, we have a podcast with Mur Lafferty from earlier this year. It was great.
Oh, great.
It was about murder in space. It was very relevant for generation ships.
It would be for generation ships, and there was murder on her. Her generation ship was essentially a closed ship mystery story.
Yeah.
But she's got that new series with more the alien. It's got aliens, like alien society and murder, all in
Yes.
one. And like I can't remember the name of that off the top of my head either. But it was a good book.
Yeah, it was great. So I have a few from the chat. I have Nonstop by Brian Aldiss. Very, very. Somebody
Not
else has
familiar.
also
Yeah.
shouted out Battlestar Galactica. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Same brainwave here. And a very interesting one, an RPG. We have Metamorphosis Alpha by James M. Ward, which is one of the first RPGs, and it was also set in space. So that's 1976. We're talking beginning of the RPG fun times. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty fun.
There's another comment about isn't Logan's Run also kind of a generation ship?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It's not a ship, but it's got the same tropes. It's got a lot of the same tropes, right? You got a closed society. Spoiler if you haven't seen that movie from the 70s. There's that stuff outside, but they believe it's a closed ship. And they do have that mandatory death at a certain age, which is what starts Logan's Run. He starts running, right? Yeah, that's a great thing. And I stole some stuff from Logan's Run, right? The mandatory death date on my ship really was a product of Logan's Run, as you know, I watched that as a teenager, which you probably shouldn't let your teenagers do, but
That's absolutely fair. Really cool. I feel like we have a very clear example of what we're talking about now with generation ships, and we've already dug into a bunch of the very common tropes, which I think is very useful when we're unpacking a concept.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the important things that you need to establish when you're world building a generation ship, when you're creating your own universe with your own generation ship? What was important for you?
Yeah, I think there's so many things, right? My book is very much a political book, so the political system was important. Who's in charge, right? Who's in charge? Who runs the ship? And for me, who runs the ship was laid out in the charter, but it has changed over time in practice because things will, right? If you take any political body, it is given a certain legal power through a document, but that power changes over time, and the people in charge are going to change over time, and how they approach it. So who's in charge? Is it the scientists? Are the scientists in charge, or is it politicians? Right. And I kind of started out my book where 250 years ago it was both. The politician was kind of a manager of things and a scheduler and a funder of resources, but the scientists, they were all true. Everybody who started this, everyone who volunteered to go on this ship was a true believer, right? They were scientists. They may have signed up just to grow stuff on the ship. They might have they'd become farmers on ships, but they were a scientist to start, and that's how they got picked for the mission. Well, 10 generations later, they're just farmers, right? And the politician controls everybody's budget. So now they've used that to consolidate power over time because they control your budget. And if they control your budget, then they control your science. So we're not maybe listening to scientists as much as we should, right? A lot of pandemic politics. And I wrote this during the pandemic. So there was a lot of that going on, right? Science versus politics. So for me, those were the big things that were going on. But then you got to world build like the little things. Where do your movies come from? Like, how do you, I have a whole entertainment department. There's an entertainment department on the ship. Why? Because they tried to, and this didn't make it onto the page. I really, really wish it had, because they tried to use AI originally and everyone hated it. So they had to have people who were going to generate the idea. Yes, I really, really wish I had put that on the page. But they have a whole department, and it's the biggest department on the ship, is to create entertainment. Because you got all the movies that were ever made. They're all 250 years old. Yeah. And so now you've got the whole entertainment department. You have authors who write books and screenplays. Now they have to do double duty. They may still have to clean bathroom too, but whatever. They have to do their part for the ship, but they also, that's their job, is to create entertainment. You have to have food. Where's your food source, right? That is huge. You've got to feed people, right? You've got to feed people forever, right? And we use crickets on my ship. We use crickets because they're the lightest weight. source of protein that you can have, and weight matters. So we're going to grow crickets. Well, now you're going to grow crickets. Well, what do you have to have? You got to have the things that crickets eat, right? And crickets, it's just a fun note on my ship. There's always a cricket somewhere, because they escaped containment, because they're crickets. And if you've ever been around crickets, you will not keep them in one place. There will be a cricket in your room and you won't find it. So they're all over the ship, right? And we use those to make the protein that we use for our fabricators, because we've got food fabricators, but they need base blocks, right? They need carbohydrates, they need protein. So we grow potatoes, right? We grow potatoes as part of that. And why do we grow potatoes? Well, they grow in dirt. Well, that's really heavy, sure, but we put it on the outside of the ship, and it helps absorb some of that space radiation that might come through your plating, right? Yes, you have irradiated potatoes, but you treat those, as you break them down into their blocks. That's not a problem anymore. You strip that out as part of the eating process. So where does your food come from? What's your economy, right? I do two economies. There's the official economy, and then there's the black market, because of course there is, right?
Yeah.
And there's the part of the black market where they're trying to stop, and there's the part of the black market that everybody just turns a blind eye to, because we got to have our hooch, right? We got to have our vodka. We make potatoes. Somebody's making bathtub vodka.
I was already wondering if everybody was drinking like cricket flavored bathtub vodka. That was already going to be my next question.
Yeah, I mean, well, because of course they are. Right. And some of that came from my time in the Army, especially working, like when I worked with the Russians will ferment anything. Like if you give them a loaf of bread, they can make alcohol out of it. I don't know how, but they can, and they will. They're amazing. They'll whatever you give them, like fruit, of course, that's an obvious one. But bread, you wouldn't think you could make alcohol out of bread. You'd be wrong. It might make you go blind. That's an issue, right? But where does your fun come from, right? Yeah. Where do people find their own time? We talked about alone time, right? So where do your introverts go?
Yeah,
because they got to go somewhere, right? And so they find out where they're going to go. Yeah, and some of this is stolen from real life stuff, right? Somebody mentioned a Navy ship, right? Yeah, that's true. Soldiers
so I have a
and
comment
sailors
here.
will definitely.
Sorry, Michael.
Go ahead.
I have a comment here. My brother used to be on a Navy ship, and he told me about the black market that was on there. So yeah, absolutely. That's just the kind of thing that you're referring to as well, right, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of chatter. Cedra Honnet says insects by weight have 80% more protein than beef. So yeah, absolutely a good choice to take into space.
Yeah, that's not a trope. I didn't invent crickets in space, right? That's something that actually is being studied. Like NASA, as they study the chances of putting someone in a long-term colony and needing protein, crickets are certainly a source of that, right? And there's a whole bunch of fungi and stuff, which I did not get into in my book because they're not as cool as crickets. Yeah. Crickets make for a good story. When you talk about economy, are people using money to buy food? That's a great question, right? So we have the basic economy provides for your food. Okay, so we have two economy, and then you have what's called luxury credits, and you earn a certain number of luxury credits every month. Everybody earns them, right? And they can use their luxury credits on things that are not necessities. So you get a 20-second shower a day. If you want another 20 seconds of water, you can pay for that with your luxury credits, whatever is important to you, right? Different kinds of food. You can go to the luxury credit. You can go to the luxury credit thing and spend a certain amount to get a different kind of food, right? Basic coffee is probably paid for, but if you want your latte, I mean, this is metaphorically speaking. If you want your latte, you got to spend luxury credits, right? And everybody has those, and those become a black market product, right? You could trade your luxury credits for what they call script, which is black market stuff, which is how you can buy your drugs. Or, we have all kinds of cool pharmaceuticals that the science department kicked up. Right. The drug of choice on the ship is called Star, and it's because it's a star-shaped tablet, and I just invented it. It's kind of a, I don't know, stimulant, mood enhancer, LSD mix, something like that.
Really interesting. So it sounds like, and I love this, it sounds like it depends what's important for your world is one of the really critical things. And then it depends what's important for being human, and the human element sounds like another thing that you really dug into. What about technology? Because I feel like one of we've mentioned Battlestar Galactica. They had literal telephones to communicate across the ship, right?
Yeah.
That's something that's very different to, a sleek Star Trek kind of ship. You know, can people communicate with the home world is another thing that you mentioned, and how does that affect the way that power structures work? How much have you seen this sort of dug into when you're creating a generation ship?
I think you can do as much as you want, right?
Yeah.
I tend to be anachronistic. I tend to default to real world things,
Yeah.
which is why I like the idea of a generation ship, because in my world, this thing launched in 2021 in the 22nd century, so it's
Yeah.
not that far advanced. And you could do all kinds of things that you can do anything you want, right? I mean, the technology, you can do as much or as little. I tend to, and this is a criticism of all my books, I would say, by people who are really into that advanced technology, science fiction, is I definitely advance in certain areas, but I tend to default to, tablets. We're still using tablets, and we don't use paper, but we do use tablets, right? And things like that, and or things that are in the future that we'll probably see in 15 years. I've now projected out 100 years.
Mm.
There already people can see stuff on their glasses, right? And we have virtual reality stuff, and I increase that, but I don't really get super unique in those aspects. And I do that, one, because I have no imagination, but two, also because I want the focus to be on the characters, right?
Yeah.
But you can do as much as you want. You can do as much technology as you want. I mean, just go back to some of the sci-fi of the 50s that is projecting out, things that are real today, and stuff like that. But you can do as much or as little as you want, and you can make up all kinds of reasons for why it didn't happen, right? We can say we don't use Bluetooth on the ship because it interferes with the ship systems.
Yeah.
Okay, and we tried to use it, so we don't. So now we have to use a handheld telephone, which I think they used because they just didn't, they modeled it after a real ship, which, hey, the guy picks up the telephone, right?
Yeah, but I mean, also specifically for Battlestar Galactica, that was about the mood of the ship. They wanted to create the ship that was old. They wanted to create, the Hulk of the past. And a very good way of doing that in that case was having this obviously outmoded technology that like nobody else has. Like the ship was basically a museum.
Right.
And that was a very useful way of, in my opinion, a very useful way of like using the technology to signify something about this ship in a very show don't tell way.
Yeah, and it was
That then
definitely
became,
it was the inciting event of Battlestar Galactica 2004 as compared to the original. The
yeah,
original, it was an attack on Earth, right? And
yeah,
they're but here it was a cyber attack on the ships, and all the ships that were, and the reason they were actually too old, right? And so for my Planetside novels, I do a lot of hacking, right? We because it's a mystery, and it's more of a sci-fi mystery. We're breaking into computers all the time. Well, I have a guy who works cyber defense for a big Seattle company that we won't name, but it rhymes with Microsoft. And so he tells me all the time, what am I doing? What would we be doing, without giving away all the secrets? But one of the things that you do if you want to avoid being hacked is go back generation, right? Go
mm,
back to a system that nobody used, right? So
sure,
if you're using Windows 95, nobody's going to break into it anymore, because they can't, because they don't talk to that anymore, right? So
it's not
you actually
compatible.
go
Yeah,
you go back a system.
interesting,
And
really
you could do
interesting.
that, and that could be what, with generation, with Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm
absolutely.
talking a lot.
No, no, no. You're great. This is fantastic. The last thing I wanted to dig into in important things, um, that I thought were important was
Mhm.
crime and punishment, because
Yeah.
I think a lot of us are writing stories where we've talked about murder mysteries a whole bunch, but often and mutinies. We've talked about the big stories, big things going wrong, black marketeers. Crime and punishment may come up in those kinds of stories.
Mhm.
How have you seen this handled in different kinds of fiction, and how did you approach it in your own book?
I mean, so I think the way that, I mean, if you think about it traditionally on any ship, right? Where the captain has absolute authority, right? Walking the plank, right? Why do we make people walk the plank? Because we can't have somebody who's not part of the team on board, right? And for us, one of the biggest crimes is not doing your duty. And it's bred into the kids. I mean, it's educated into the kids from the time that they're in pre-kindergarten, right? They're in preschool, doing your duty for the ship. Yeah, and somebody said they tend toward dystopia. Yeah, of course it's dystopia, right? Because it's got to be that you have to have rules, because the rules, if you don't work, we don't eat and we all die. You know, none of us want that. And so it's bred into you and it's educated into people early on that you don't let the ship down. Right. And I'm not saying if you don't show up for work one day, you know, because they're an advanced society also, right? We understand mental health. Like you just couldn't, right? You just couldn't, and you had to have a day off or whatever. And some of that is built in, into the system. And we don't really talk about murders on the ship where we are, but historically, everybody knows every murder that's happened on the ship, right? Because think about it. If you lived in a town of 18,000 people, right? You know the history of your town. Like if someone was murdered in your little town of 18,000 people, everybody knows about it. That's not a thing that's leading the news for a week or longer. And you're still talking about it 5 generations later, right? Lizzie Borden took her axe or whatever. And it lives on forever, right? And so those people are pariahs, and they're put into the recycler because we're not gonna space anybody, right? Because I think dramatically we want to put people into space. The 100 was set on a generation ship, kind of a YA thing like that. It wasn't about the generation ship, but they got there on a generation ship, and they would space people as a punishment. No one would space anybody because you got protein and you got too much protein.
Waste of natural resources. That's
we're not wasting that protein. We're gonna recycle it, and you're eating it for dinner. It's Soylent Green.
Oh goodness! I knew it was coming. I knew Soylent Green was coming,
but
and
it's broken down to the molecular level, right? And so you don't know that you're eating grandma, but you're absolutely eating grandma. She just tastes like a steak.
Well, if she had to go, I'm sure she'd be happy. That
should be the tagline. That can be the tagline for this one, for this podcast. You're eating grandma, but she tastes like steak. Yeah,
I like it.
You'll get a different audience. You get a different audience.
I think that's the dark side of the internet, Michael.
That would be the dark side.
But let's move on. We are world builders, and we do love world building, and sometimes that can manifest as world builders disease, where we obsessively dig into things that maybe aren't as important. How deeply should we as writers or as RPG creators dig into, unimportant things in generation ships, like how engines work, or my favorite, how toilets work, this kind of thing? How much should we dig into that?
How good are you at it? What's your story about? Here's how I like to think of all world building. Why does it matter to the point of view character? So if your point of view character is a farmer on a generation ship, you best dig into the farm a little bit, right? Because why? Because that makes the character real. They care about the farm. So the reader cares about the farm, because maybe making my potato crop this month or whatever might be like my goal. I might be in a potato competition. I don't know. It might be the most important thing to my character. And if it is, then it's important to the reader. Doing it for just doing it is a little old fashioned, right? Some of the hard science fiction of old, where we're going to tell you how the ship works, but there's an audience for that, right? There's an audience for that. And you could definitely go that direction on hard sci-fi. You're not going to sell a lot of books because that audience is very small. But there is an audience and they love that, but I'm a character writer. So as much as important to the character, that's how much we're going to do. But you can also show it in passing, right? So when my rebels are meeting to have their discussion about overthrowing the ship, right? They meet in one of the farm rooms, because there's a whole bunch of identical farm rooms where we're growing green things, right? Because we need green things. One, they create oxygen. That's great. And it's an oxygen farm at the same time, but we also eat it. But the only reason you see it is because I put it as a setting. I put it in the background, right? So I'll set the scenes at a different place on the ship and let you see little bits of it, right? And then you'll inevitably get reviews that say, I would have loved to see more of the ship, right? Okay, you say that, but it would have been at the expense of pace and I think with, especially, and no offense if you're a fantasy reader or writer, fantasy writers can really get too far into the world building and not, if you're spending more time telling me about the stew than you are telling me about why the character has their motivations, I'm going to have a tough time connecting with your story for very long. It's going to get dull, right? But there's a whole subgenre of the cozies, right? So if you wanted to do a cozy generation ship, somebody should do that. It won't be me, but somebody should do that. And you could just take time lovingly describing each part of the ship and why it's important and why we polish this piece the way that we polish it or whatever.
And that is where you need World Anvil as a writer, because it's there for all of those fun details that you created that you could not put in the book because they ruined your pacing. But you can still share them with your readers. There you are. You see, that's why we made the thing.
Well, if you're successful, you could put out an editor, a director's cut, right? An author's cut, or you can use it on your website to drive content.
Yeah, I mean, that's what our authors do. A lot of them will put a QR code or a link in the back of the book, and it just goes to the World Bible of like all the extra stuff that I wrote for this book that I could not ram into the book. Like we tried AI for the creation and everyone hated it, for example. All right, let's talk about speaking of AI, let's talk about common mistakes that people make when creating generation ships. What have you seen? We're not here to throw shade. We're not here to name names. This is not about being nasty. This is about learning. And folks in the chat, I invite you to join in. Common mistakes that people make when creating generation ships. What do you think, Michael?
I don't. There are a few enough generation ship books out there that I don't think they're anything I would call a mistake is a place where an author chose to focus on a different aspect of the ship than I did.
Yeah, that's okay though. Like, what has rankled you? Like, what has caught your eye?
I mean, honestly, I know this isn't what you're looking for, but really nothing. Because we can assume. I think what would bother me is if you didn't have a resource constrained environment, right? If you didn't act like you were in space, But on the other hand, psychologically, how much do people remember that they're actually in space? If that's just where you live, if your space, if you live in a hallway and you go to work every day inside of a building, say you lived in a large building and it had everything you needed in it and it didn't have windows.
Yeah.
Right. Think if you went to Vegas where you have these big casinos and you're inside and it has everything you need. Okay. And then you walk outside and it's 14 hours later and you don't know where the time went, right? Because you were inside and you don't even have to realize that there's an outside anywhere. Yeah. Arcologies, somebody said that's exactly it. Right. You might just not remember that it's there. So it could be what you want to do with it psychologically that people don't want to do that. Yeah. So for me, there are so many things that you can do that nothing that you do, am I going to say, well, that's wrong? Because as long as you give a reason for it, why do we do it this way? Right? As long as your world works for you. And this is all world building, by the way. I get frustrated in fantasy when they have a 400,000 person army. Okay. Who's feeding them? Right. Go get your go get a Civil War logistics book, which exists. You can check it out at your library and see how many wagons you need to feed how many people. Right. And now you realize that you have to bring in 40,000 wagons worth of food every day. Okay. Which is impossible. It cannot be done because every day you'd have to go further to get them. Right. Yeah. So you now have a logistical army that's 9 times the size of your army, and it's the entire population of your country. So when you don't take into consideration logistics in any world building, I have trouble with that. Now you can make up stuff, right? Robert Jordan famously has the big armies, but he has traveling. So they go through the gates, right? And all the horses and buggies come through the gates, and they feed, but there are people who are dedicated to maintaining the gates. So now some of your wizards can't fight because they have to keep feeding you. But stuff like that. And generation ship would be the same way, right? How are we eating? Like, we need to know. There are certain world building things that we can't not have. That we have to know. How do you eat? You have to eat. And I think it would be tough on a generation ship if you didn't include those basics.
Yeah. Kitoy says putting an AI in control of your ship is something that he is flags as something that might be a mistake, or something that would rankle him.
Yeah, but I mean, unless it's your conflict, right? I mean, isn't HAL an evil AI? An evil AI in charge of your spaceship. Wow, that's never been done. That's a trope, right?
Yeah.
For me, there is no AI on our spaceship. It's illegal because of an unspecified event that happened on Earth before we took off, right? So we are terrified of AIs. We use we're allowed to use weak AIs on the ship, but no strong AIs because of the strong AI revolution. I put it distantly, 200 and 300 years in the past. But it was such a big deal on Earth that we've created this situation now on the ship where we don't use them. But somebody is starting to use one, and that is part of the plot.
Very interesting. I would flag from earlier in our conversation that a lot of what we've been talking about today is not just about generation ships. I've seen Snowpiercer brought up, which is a generation train in many ways. Sure. I've seen the vaults of Fallout brought up, which are in many ways exactly the same kind of thing, except you're not going anywhere, you're staying still.
I'm less familiar with that one, but I'll take your word for it.
Everybody's trapped underground in a nuclear bunker.
Sure. Wool, which is the Apple series, the Hugh Howey books. Wool. They call it Silo on Apple TV.
Silo, yes,
but it comes from the book Wool, which is another closed society. And honestly, I did a lot of I stole some of that from my world building from you.
I think a common mistake I've seen in generation ships is a little bit white box syndrome.
Sure.
So not giving enough flavor of the different spaces. It's this kind of assumption that humans would live in a kind of Star Trek environment where every single space is exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people would do that. I think people would cozy up spaces, and people would
I definitely
have
talk
clean
about that.
spaces and that kind of thing.
Which is bad for me because I write white box. My early draft, like if you go read an early draft of Generation Ship, it would very much feel that way.
My early drafts are the same.
Right, I do the same thing with all about world building. Yeah, get the thing, and then I'll paint the walls on the second. I'll build the house first, then I'll paint the walls.
Yeah.
And I'll paint them on the second way through. And someone said people like nesting. And we have nesting specifically. Like you could pick the color of your room. And it tells about their personality, right? Now, how they decorate their room now shows you something about that character. Because what about the guy who lives in the apartment the way that he got it? He never changed anything, right? And there's that character. He's in the ship, and he's one of the main characters. But it tells us something about him, right? That he doesn't do that when other people do. So yeah, I think you can do a lot because everything comes back to character.
Yeah.
Right. The world building only matters. Show your world building as your character is moving through the world. Yeah. Show me your world building as your character is interacting with it. Right. If you want to show me a market and how it works, show your character trying to buy something because they need it, and now they can't find it, or they have a conflict. Give your character a reason to interact with the world, even if it's a made up one, so that I can see your world through the eyes of your character and have the world tell me not just about the world, but about the character.
I always say, make it in motion and emotional.
There you go. That's great. Saying. I'm stealing that. I will use that in my next class that I teach. I'm teaching a class on. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I have a class I'm teaching for a library in October on
Oh, fun.
character, and I'm using that line. That's great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's I have a whole seminar on exposition and getting exposition right, because when you've done all your juicy world building, you want to get it out in the right way so people care about it. And yeah, in motion and emotional is like
Yeah. Well, and it's
rule
the
number one
iceberg,
as far as
right?
I'm
It's the
yeah,
iceberg.
yeah,
90% of it's not on the page. It's
yeah,
in, but you still did it.
yeah,
You built all that stuff to give me the 10% and make the 10% pretty.
yeah, absolutely. And all that iceberg can come back later and later and pay forward again and
Hmm.
again in the writing.
Yeah.
Let's have a look. We have two very interesting audience questions. One of them is, how do things like procedures change if something catastrophic happens on a generation ship?
Yeah. So on my ship, we didn't really have a good plan for that, um, which is great because that's conflict, right? I used some plot spackle to because in theory you would have you would have everything planned out,
Yeah,
but in reality something would happen that you didn't plan.
yeah,
Um, I think an intelligent way to handle that would be the way that you handle a hospital handles a death when they have the death of a patient, right? They're gonna have an M&M. They're gonna have they're gonna have a post mortem where they all get together and they talk about, okay, what happened? Why did it happen? Whose fault is it? What are we going to do so it never happens again?
yeah.
And that would be a really, really healthy way to handle that my ship didn't do, because I mean, healthy is no fun, right? If we were all good, like if we all got along and we all agreed, then there'd be no conflict, right? And we need conflict.
Mhm. That's really interesting. All right, a question here. From MY Gin Up, I'm guessing. If population and birth is so tightly controlled on a generation ship, is there a golden ratio between men and women that a civilization should strive for?
I think you could write that if you wanted to. That would be a really, really neat element to do. I scienced my way out of it, right? Is that
Nice.
well, because you can have whatever you want. And I didn't make a ratio. That's a great question. Would you want to keep it fairly even? I think so. If you just for pairing purposes, if you talk about, if you believe that the same amount of men are attracted to men as women who are attracted to women, and I don't know if that's true or not, and so you're going to have equal numbers there, then you're going to want equal numbers to pair off if they do. But we have polys on the ship, so is that even necessary? You could absolutely make that a thing. On my ship you didn't, because it was all genetically done, right? There's no natural childbirth, so all the men are sterilized, right? Which is, I think, is a cool world building thing to do, just because we always do it the other way, right? So, but it's much easier to sterilize men, and so that we don't have any accidents. Because if you put teenagers in the same place, there's going to be extracurricular activity. So all men are sterilized, and when they get a license to do that, they are unsterilized. And I make the procedures much more forward than they are today for those
Yeah.
things, right? And because it's so invasive to women to sterilize women, we don't really do that, because if you sterilize all the men, you don't have to. And also, I didn't want to talk about women reproductive cycles and everything on the ship and get into all that, because that is a huge issue for real space, right? And I don't want to do it, because let a woman writer write that book, please, not me. And so I did not have a ratio, because we do science, right? I did not think about whether you had a license to have a boy or a girl.
Mm.
It just kind of, yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had thought of that.
This is the joy of having an amazing world building community at your side, and I can safely say World Amble is definitely that. So, a little birdie told me, we talked about at the beginning, you have a new book coming out, which is part of the Planetside series. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this dark side, I'm bad at cameras.
We
Dark
see it. We
side
see it.
it's the
Wait, stay still. Stay still. I want to show it
oh,
big.
okay, hold on. There you
Hey,
go.
there we go.
Right.
Michael is showing off the cover of the Dark Side novel, and it looks
Yeah.
beautiful, can I just say?
Thank you. I've been very, very fortunate with artists, and Harper Collins, who publishes it, has given me a lot of input with picking artists and the covers, and I really appreciate them for that. Yeah, so the Planetside series, it's a 4-book series, and this is the 4th book. You can jump in at book 4, you know, but also it goes back to the Planetside, which is about an army colonel who is nearing the end of his time in the military, and they send him to a distant planet to look for a missing person. So a senator's son has gone missing in a combat zone, and it's his job to go find him. And so it's really a series of mysteries set in military science fiction environments, where he goes and tries to find this missing person and realize that there's been a cover up and there's a conspiracy and all kinds of things, and many things are happening that were not things that he expected. And it's all happening in a war zone. And so that's a series of 4 books. It will be a series of 6 books. I've signed on for 2 more with HarperCollins, and I will probably finish writing the 5th one today after we get off today. So that's probably my thing.
That's very exciting. Finished writing draft 1, or?
No, this will be the draft that gets turned in. So draft 3 for me. I turn in my 3rd draft to the publisher, and then there'll be 3 more after that. But
sure, that will be the reviews and the revisions and the edits and stuff, I guess.
And yeah, it'll be edits again. 3, probably 4 more edits. Second edits, maybe if I don't get the first ones right. Copy edits, and then page proofs.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you so very much for coming in to talk to us about generationships.
Yeah.
Is there anything you would like to say to our beans in the chat who are thinking maybe they'd like to experiment with a generationship for the first time?
I mean, read my book. I don't. What am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to say here? It's called Generationship. How could it be? How could you? I literally wrote the book. I think we talked about some examples of generationship books that you can go on, or you could look into and read. Yeah, but I would love for you to read my book. Not enough people read Generationship, so I don't get to write another one. But if more people read it, yeah. So, I mean, that's part of it, right? As an author, you have to balance what the publisher wants to pay for and what you really, really want to write. And with Generationship, I got to do both. That was my dream book. I've been thinking about it since I started writing. I was not good enough to write it when I started out as a writer. I had to develop new skill sets to be prepared to do it the justice that it deserved. And so it was like my 5th or 6th book. I think it was my 6th book by the time I thought I was ready to do it.
Yeah. I saw that was partly because of all the POVs, which is, again, a thing that I wanted to touch on, but POVs and generationships, right?
Yeah, well, just POVs in general. There's 5 points of view in this book, whereas all my other books are 1 point of view, and it's 5 times as complicated.
Goodness.
And we could talk. I could talk for another hour about point of view, but we don't have another hour, so we won't do that.
Maybe you can come back another time, Michael, and we could talk for an hour about point of view. I would love that.
Absolutely. You know how to find me.
I know how to find you. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us to talk about generationships. They are absolutely fascinating, and I hope this has inspired you to dig in and have a go with them. They really are a wonderful storytelling space. But the fun is not over for this evening. Oh, no, no, no. We are premiering a video today on sword and sorcery. So you've had your sci-fi, now it's fantasy time. Why don't you hop on over to the YouTubes where we will be chatting and watching the video as it goes live. I will be in the chat answering your questions as well. So yeah, come and join us. Grab a bio break, grab a drink, and yeah, come hang out for just a little bit longer and learn all about sword and sorcery. And of course, we will be back tomorrow with some incredible community stuff. Secondhand is going live with some of our Best of World Anvil Awards winners, talking about world building. And yeah, there is everything to play for. We have, of course, the Institutions of Education, sorry, it's very late here. The Institutions of Education competition going on right now as well. So if you fancy writing a science school on a generation ship, I feel like we've got you covered today. All right, folks, you have the most wonderful day. I'll see you over on the YouTube, and I'll talk to you soon. Now grab your hammer and go world build. Bye, everyone.